I like to use the technique that we use in juridical science. It's a good method, and I call it the juridical science method. And we have rules in a court of law. So we have both parties there. We have an atheist saying there is no God. We have a believer saying, yes, there is. So along comes the atheist, and the judge says, where's your evidence? There's no God. And he says, I don't have to bring any evidence. And then the judge will say, you know, you're pleading no contest.
Hey, Guy Powell here, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book, The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2,000 years. And today we've got a real honor. We have William Redd, and he has been researching and working with the Shroud for quite a bit of time. And he's a speaker and all kinds of great stuff around the Shroud. And he has a fascinating presentation today about evidence for God. Well, with that, let me tell you a little bit more about Will. He is a former Navy weapons engineer. Then he was a lawyer and of course a theologian. He spent the last decade applying juridical science to examine the Shroud, and after discovering flaws in the carbon-14 dating, he's used legal reasoning to argue its authenticity beyond reasonable doubt. And that's what's critical, is especially in the minds of a lawyer, is beyond reasonable doubt. William, thank you so much for being here. Welcome, and so excited to hear what you're going to talk about.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Guy, for allowing me to have a chat because I am excited about the Shroud. And today I want to present where the Shroud sits in the whole field of science. It's not just a matter of an isolated incident, an isolated bit of evidence. And what we need to do is come to a common sense formula to find out, hold on, do we just put this in a world of atheism where there is no God? Why can't we join it in to the whole field of science? And for that, you've got to know what the ordinary person thinks of common sense. One of the starting places for me was collecting the data of what people believe. And we always go into these things with, oh, forget God and just look at it. But I'm going to put something a bit different. The ordinary person believes there's a spiritual realm. And to find that out, you only need to look at the Pew report, and it gives the following data on the religion. It says 4% and people who say there is no God. It says 10% are undecided. And it says 86% believe and have concluded that there's a spiritual realm, whether that's Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, or Christianity. So that's what the ordinary person thinks in that way. And that data means a lot because from that data, we can get a perspective on all the evidence. So what we've got these days is we got people who are atheists, and I'll just deflect a little bit there because there are neo-atheists out there who want to redefine the term atheism, and they say it's an absence of belief in God. So by their new definition, they want to join atheism and agnosticism together. So instead of saying an absence of belief, we've got 4% of the world's population are atheists and 10% are agnostic. So we can look at that 4% using what's called the p-value test. And that p-value test is a measure in science, and it says anything less than 5% is insignificant. So here we've got atheists who say there is no God. They've got an insignificant argument. And the worst thing is they don't present any evidence for the non-existence of God. And that's why they're an insignificant amount. Now, I originally told this p-value structure and test and data to a psychologist friend of mine because they use this p-value an awful lot in their assessments of people to find out if people are deluded. And when I explained the data, etc., he said to me, this is great. This is 10, 20 years ago. He said, this is absolutely great. What you've explained is the world's collective knowledge. So everyone, the majority knows, and we can dismiss the atheist no God view because it's too tiny. The majority knows there's a spiritual realm. And of that 86% majority, 77% connect Jesus having something to do with God. So when you've got the shroud in that context, the whole world knows that you're not just looking at it isolated. This is one form of very strong evidence to say these people, the majority, have got it right, because the shroud itself shows miracles happening, things that are impossible to happen, have happened 2,000 years ago. And with the big context that there is a spiritual realm, wow, where do we go from there? And so we can look at those people who distract with all kinds of things like saying, oh, there isn't a God, he's a myth, and all that sort of thing. We've got to put them aside because they're the people who don't present any scientific evidence.
You
Because
know,
we
it's
need,
interesting if I could interrupt you there, Will. What's funny is that 4% sometimes, though, is they have the voices of I don't know 50% sometimes, and I really like your comparison with this p-value test, where the 4% is actually insignificant, even though they seem to be very loud. They really are relatively insignificant, and even statistically, which is where the science comes in, which I really appreciate. That's really interesting.
yeah. And the odd thing is there's one of these people out there who's got his book's called The God Delusion. And my friend who assessed the p-value, a psychologist, he uses that 5% insignificant to determine if someone's deluded. Now, to make sure you're not deluded, you've got to have the evidence. And one of the people that was in such a tiny amount was Copernicus, a mathematician. Everyone thought we got a flat earth until he came along. But he provided evidence. And we ain't getting that evidence from the people who say no God. We've got a movement who wants to camouflage the 4% and redefine atheism, etc. And another thing is, I like to use the technique that we use in juridical science. It's a good method, and I call it the juridical science method. And we have rules in a court of law. So we have both parties there. We have an atheist saying there is no God. We have a believer saying, yes, there is. So along comes the atheist, and the judge says, where's your evidence? There's no God. And he says, I don't have to bring any evidence. And then the judge will say, you know, you're pleading no contest. You're just coming here thinking that you can dismantle the other side's argument, but you're not putting any evidence. That's one of the most,
Mhm.
I was going to use an insult, but that's one of the most poorest things to go to court if you haven't got any evidence supporting your side. So those atheists are not doing anything. So as you know from the Shroud, we've got the Shroud evidence for a start, but it gets a lot more than that because the juridical science method, or to put it in ordinary people's words, in the law, we have to work out what would the ordinary person think. So you have a jury, they've got no qualifications. They're just expected to look at everything and work out through common sense is probably the everyday word, what this means. And ordinary people will come up with verdicts of guilty and non-guilty because that's what the judge wants to find out. What's the ordinary person think? And even when a judge alone trial happens, that judge has to think, what would the ordinary person say? So we've got plenty of court cases out there which define that the rule is, what would an ordinary, reasonable person, being of fair mind, being fully observant of all the facts, and being of firm mind, not deluded, consider and conclude? So we've got all that data there from the Pew report saying, here it is, there is a God. This is the majority people. One of the things about collecting all this information is these are people with different religions, but they've got some very basic elements in there. One, 86% have concluded there's a spiritual realm, and 77% have concluded Jesus has something to do with God. So we know that's what the ordinary, reasonable person of firm mind will conclude. So there's a God. So we can stick the shroud into that and not just say, oh, something special happened. We can't explain it. But no, the ordinary person puts that into the realm and saying, this is what God did. It's not just to grasp a way to say, oh, yeah, but you can't explain everything. Well, yes, we can, because when the majority have concluded there is a God, therefore the shroud was created by God, the circumstances there. So this corroborates what the shroud has done. And listening to Olivia's broadcast, he's looking at all kinds of sciences. If I remember correctly, there were about 10 different sciences or something, and all pointing towards God. And why wouldn't they? Because that's the majority, ordinary person, reasonable conclusion. So we've got a context there. And this, as I've referred to the p-value test and data analysis, is very commonly used method, not only in psychology, but in business, because it makes so much reasonable sense. You go and do an analysis of a particular community, and you can find out, if you're a marketing person, what's the best way to market your product? Will it be successful in that area? So it's a great way of coming to a conclusion of either on the balance of probabilities, that's right, or even stronger, beyond reasonable doubt. The marketing shows also that all these people around the world, in their own circumstances, be they isolated little tribes somewhere, look around and they always come up with a conclusion that something spiritual is happening. So if we're like meters all around the planet, and those percentages are not, that I've put together, are not on a little sample here or there or everywhere. That's on the whole population of the Earth. So we've found a distinct pattern around the whole planet where people are recognizing something spiritual is happening. They bring up their own explanations, but now consistently we've got Jesus has something to do with God. In the most technological and modern world, it's all coming back to Jesus. So whether you've concluded he's a prophet of God or he's like I have, he's one of the Holy Trinity, we know something special is happening here and we're not isolated. Even though the loud minority is saying, oh, that's not scientific, we're scientific, and you've got to give us science, when in fact they're being given science. The fact is they haven't come to the point where they realize they're in a very tiny little group and the rest of the world says, nah.
If I could interject there, you're so right. But one other thing, it's not only the 86% of the people that are alive today. it's also, at least for the 2000 years that Jesus is part of it, for all of those people that were alive and have now gone on. And so it's a huge number of people. And if you go even prior to Jesus, there was clearly some recognition that there was something that was larger than themselves, that they, that in the spiritual realm, that was guiding, what they were doing. So when you think about it that way, it's 86% of the whatever it is, 7 billion alive today, and then plus the billions and billions that have gone before us.
Yeah, they're all looking with common sense, how do I work this out? And consistently through the planet, everyone's saying there's a spiritual life, what's going on? And the more knowledgeable we get, we're all tying Jesus into the relationship with God. So that's science. We have another thing here. And Jesus said, "Don't believe me for what I say, but believe my miracles in life." And we've got a miracle in the shroud there. It's something so unique. We're not seeing it happen everywhere. It's just one off. Over 2000 years, we only got one. So that's a miracle. One of the arguments too is I use and I give example in my book. Oh, it's an ebook, that one. And I give examples of miracles. But first of all, in law, how do you assess a miracle? And I'll put a couple of cases in compensation law because and in a workplace, there are sometimes accidents that happen with no witnesses. So the rule in law is if the employer can't disprove it, then the claimant wins without any witnesses. If the injury is consistent with the story that the injured party has said, wins. 51% probability it's right. And a couple of miracles, and there's millions of them around the world, but I've put two examples in my book. One of them was my landlady, Vera, and she'd been to Sydney Eye Hospital, which is a specialist clinic, because she lost sight in one eye. Now, after months, there were 16 specialists who had a look at it, and every single one says, "Vera, you'll never be able to see out of that eye again." So she told the church. 2 weeks they prayed for her, and she got her sight back.
Mhm.
So the testimony of all those witnesses is God intervened and did it. We've got all the scientists saying it can't happen, but it did. And the second one was Flo, who I went to church with in a Baptist church 40 years ago. And she told me the story. She was going to have a mastectomy. She's on the day of operation. The pastor walked in and he prayed with her for 15 minutes, anointed her with oil and left. The surgeon came in, ready to do the operation, did one more check, and the tumor was gone. No mastectomy. The only thing that happened between all the medical records and tests and everything was the prayer to God. And the reasonable person would say God intervened. We've got 86% of the world say there's a spiritual realm, but the doctors did everything else. Final result, it's got to come off. And then one more check for out of the blue. He could have just rushed her in, but he did a final check and it's gone. Those aren't uncommon miracles. I mean, the testimony of the gospel shows all these miracles. And the big testimony of all these thousands of people crowding Jesus is a testimony, well, he's doing something right. He's doing these things, and they're all coming and bringing them. And we still see that today, the miracles in life. So we have dismissive atheists who are locked in, there's no God, whereas 86% of the world will say, yeah, it's spiritual, something like that's happened. Physically, scientifically, it can't happen, but we've got these miracles. And this is the same story we're finding out with the shroud. This can't happen. There's no way that it could have been done. We're finding other ways. Scientists are saying, well, it can be done this way with all this sort of radiation and whatever have techniques, but that wasn't happening 2,000 years ago. The Pharaoh didn't have a particular machine that could do that. So the only eventuation is God intervened with special techniques. So the shroud's getting proved by the common sense method of statistical data analysis that the world says, yeah, there is a spiritual life, and two, Jesus has something to do with it. So we've got the shroud amongst that evidence, and we've got all the very loud vocal people trying to say, oh no, that's not right. It's sort of because of they're such a tiny minority, it's their ego coming forward. When if they step back and look at the statistical data analysis, they need to be able to say, hold on, it's not just me. And as Gary, the psychologist, said, what I put together is the world's collective knowledge. Now, that's important because you've got the atheists and lots of people getting sucked into, oh, there's a difference between science and religion. There isn't, because religion is its own science. It's a collection of knowledge. Even though you've got different ones, we've got the basic foundations that there's a spiritual realm and Jesus is something to God, very solid scientific foundations. And now we're testing all the tinier details, and they do that in all the sciences. So one of the famous people that I like to refer to is a guy named Thomas Aquinas centuries ago. And he said quite clearly, theology is the queen of the sciences. It is a collection of knowledge, data, which we can scientifically work out what the spiritual realm's about. We've got data from all around the world. So religion is a science. You can't properly deny it because it's a collection of knowledge and the interpretation of it. And again, I was on a blog when the bloggers decided that law isn't science, when in fact we call it juridical science, and you can get a doctorate in it. But that's got the methodology, the method to how to look at things from a common sense approach. And that's why we've got those rules of what's right and wrong. We have in our courts, one of the wonderful principles is the Wednesbury principle, which says something is so unreasonable that no reasonable person would do it. And that's in hundreds of thousands of cases. And yet I was told I need to give a peer review of it in journals, etc. Well, it's recorded in all these cases of this is how you got to be reasonable and how to get rid of absurdities. Now, the atheist position, there is no God, with no evidence, that wouldn't be accepted in a court of law. You have to come and bring it in. So we've got reason to reject the atheist position because it's so unreasonable. No reasonable person would be so assertive to say, oh, there is no God and I don't have to prove it. Well, that's in a pub or a coffee lounge or something like that, but it's not in the very strict courts of law. Well, you need to put it there. And science is like a big court as well. Let's test what you're saying. And if you're not giving any evidence, you haven't got it. But we, quite wonderfully, have the best connecting evidence in the Shroud because it goes back 2,000 years. There's no one else that's got that. We do have a few bodies of pharaohs and things, but we've got this wonderful connective shroud, which can only be described as an intervention, a spiritual intervention. Well, it can be described as more so only, can best be described as a spiritual representative. It's come out of the blue in an environment that doesn't have the technology to create it. And it's saying the shroud is a miracle. It's not just some glitch in the matrix, but it's a real intervention. We've got a history here. One of the curious things for me, because in science you keep going into the details, is DNA tests. Can we find the DNA of Jesus? Because both the cloths have been handled so many times. Can we find it? And what will that say? Because God was his father. Is that DNA going to be found that, hold on, something so way out, so fantastic in the DNA there? That'd be wonderful too, but they're exploring that. So this shroud is more than just the fingerprints. This is the cold case that we've been seeing on YouTube a lot about cold cases in the past and figuring what's the most reasonable explanation. And we're getting it from the shroud. So many details there.
Right.
Yeah. So,
Well, too, there's certainly the shroud is miraculous, and there's certainly evidence that it is miraculous. The other thing is that even the church, the Roman Catholic Church, if you want to be sanctified, then you have to, there's investigations that go on that this person, this individual was able to be responsible for, I think it's two miracles. And so there are other miracles that take place that have been proven. And so there are, where do these miracles come from? They can't come from nothing. They have to come from something. And so the spiritual realm, God, is has to be somewhere behind that to effectuate these miracles.
yeah, they're very stringent of when they define what's a miracle in the Catholic Church. But you get the unreasonable people mocking and laughing. That's all they've got. And actually, in the Bible, it says mockers will come in the end times. So instead of reasoning, using the legal principles of discernment, asking yourself, hold on, what would the ordinary person think under these circumstances? All we're getting from the opposing sides after the conclusion that, let's say, the Catholic Church made that something's a miracle, intense scrutiny, you get laughter and mocking. But that's not science, laughter and mocking. The passion to say, oh, there is no God and nobody's going to change my mind is not science either. And then to claim to be scientific for those who are claiming that there is no God. Well, 86% of the world says go the other way. And one of the unusual thought processes, I ask myself, you're an atheist, a no-godder. You have the choice to be undecided. So why are you saying there's no God when you've got no evidence? Why don't you become an agnostic? And then when I look at the agnostics, I say, have a look. There's no evidence to say there is no God. So why are you undecided when 86% have said there's a spiritual realm? We have a wonderful background then for philosophy of law, common sense, where we look at the shroud and the sensible, most reasonable presentation is this is a miracle of God. It's not a matter of, oh, I can out-talk you and use this great complicated language, which hardly anyone can understand. I understand the philosophers doing that, and when I listen to them, I think these are like those lawyers who use all this funny language which no one understands, when the best way is to use plain language, ordinary people's language, and that way they can understand. It's sort of surprising to me, but it needs to be done because there's some people who specialize in that philosophy. But if you boil it down, basic thing is what's common sense, and the law has given us that process. If you don't know, just ask yourself, what would a reasonable person do who's got a firm mind, who's fair-minded, not just arrogant, and also fully conversant of the facts. So what would that person do? And you put aside your own ego and say, this is what it says. So that's why science does prove God, and theology and religion are sciences. They're collections of knowledge, and we discuss them and we come to conclusions and interpretations. So yeah, science does prove God, and we're blessed with the shroud as well as one of those fantastic forensic evidences. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely. And it's funny too, you mentioned arguments where, you could call it highfalutin or very complex language is used and it just confuses the reasonable person, I think you called him, and
yeah,
trying to understand, well, what did he say or what did she say? And I think that's the purpose is that they're trying to confuse you and win you over when in reality, if they were able to use
yeah.
simple language, they couldn't get their it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to get their points across.
Exactly. That's why I've introduced it very simply with the data analysis and the method that juridical science uses. But they camouflage their words and take away the impact. And one of the compliments that I've gotten through my life is from different people. They say, I listen to all those lawyers. I haven't got a clue what they're saying. I come to you and I've got it in 30 seconds. So you use plain language to
Right.
describe it. The lawyers, I'm a little bit off track here, but lawyers will say something in the event of this occurring. Well, forget in the event of, you say if it happens. People understand, but they bring this highfalutin language and people lose it and they don't understand quite clearly what we're talking about. And
Well, but
what
lawyers get paid by the word. So in the event of that's four words, if I use if, I only get one quarter of the pay, isn't
well, that's the problem, isn't it? And that's
Sorry, I
why
don't mean
no, I'm
to.
absolutely agreed with you. That's why Jesus told the Pharisees off from all their legal stuff, etc. So everyone knows, I could ask the question, what's the difference between a lawyer and a liar? None. But I'm sorry for the joke. There's some wonderful lawyers out there, and we've got a team of lawyers working for a sign of God, like Teddy Pappas and all the other
Mm.
guys that have been wonderful. We got a wonderful Joe Marino who's documented so many things that are relevant. But yeah, the common sense view now, because 86% say there's a spiritual life and there's a spiritual realm and Jesus has something to do with it. The common sense is to say, forget all the detractors. Yes, beyond reasonable doubt, the shroud is a miracle and it's Jesus. That's the common sense view. But all the detractors with the name calling and mockery who don't provide any evidence, you've got to just ignore them too.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's the summary of what I wanted to say, how science proves God. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that is fantastic, and it's so important. And for those of us that are faithful, the different arguments that can be used when talking to someone that's trying to confuse us, or one of the four percenters, it really does help to sharpen the way that we can talk and discuss and trying to maybe not win them over, but at least weaken the way that they think about things. And I do like your point about taking the, if you're an atheist, why aren't you an agnostic? And if you're an agnostic, why aren't you a believer in spirit, in the spiritual realm or in God, of course? And I really think that progression of why you are there, why are you there, is pretty critical. Now, I will admit that one of the things that I've seen, it seems to be happening, is if you're an atheist, um, and that's your worldview, and you've lived that worldview for a long time, it's very hard to get that person to change their worldview. And they're going to hang on with their fingernails and the skin of their teeth before they give up on their belief that there is no God.
Yeah, I think because they're locked into their own way of thinking. And well, what I've tried to do is introduce that the whole world thinks different from you. And you can't say, because out of the 8 billion people on our planet, you can't say that 6.8 billion of them are wrong just by saying you want to believe in that. So you've got to ask yourself the question, have I got any scientific evidence? Instead of demanding the others give you scientific evidence, you've got to ask yourself that basic question. And if you're honest with yourself, you've got to say no, no science that there's no God. So you can jump to being the agnostic and saying, well, I'm undecided now because I realise I got no evidence. So why not be undecided? And then you've got to come to the conclusion, why am I undecided? Because there's no evidence for the other. And the overwhelming majority can't be wrong. Not 6.8 billion people can't be wrong. So
Yeah.
why am I resisting? So the thing is to observe, look, and because Jesus is so prevalent, that's probably the starting point. Find out who Jesus was. Find out and say, was he a prophet? Was he part of the Holy Trinity? And then you can change your scientific perspective and say, hold on, spiritual realm is scientific, not dismissed. So yeah, that's the reasonable person's way of doing it. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really love your arguments, is there, how can folks reach you? We've got to break off now, but how can folks otherwise reach you and learn more about you and your book? Hold up your book maybe one more
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. It's an ebook. I've printed some limited copies out to hand out personally to people, but you can get it on the internet through various
Hmm.
places, and it's worth around $1 or so, um, Australian, I think that may whatever it is. So I don't make a super expensive book, and it's only a very tiny one. It's not much, as you can see. It's a booklet. So we
Yep.
haven't got too much overwhelming information to make it complicated. So thank you.
Well, the
Yeah.
simpler the better, it just makes it a lot easier to understand, and then it helps all of us to use those arguments to to continue to profess our faiths to those that are either agnostic or atheistic. Will, thank you so much. That's been fascinating, and I really appreciate it. And that's some good stuff for us to contemplate. For the audience, definitely stay tuned for many other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And please visit guypowell.com if you'd like more information on me and the podcast. And look for what was the name of the book? It was Science Proves God.
Yes.
And look for that online, and it's in
Yeah.
various places, I'm sure. Science Proves God, and then
Yeah.
download that, and hopefully you'll enjoy it and learn more about the argumentation for
Yeah.
God and for Jesus Christ.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Guy. Much appreciated. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will. All right, we'll
And
be seeing you then. Thank you.
and thank God too.
How true, how true.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah.
That is
Thank God.
absolutely true. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Beautiful.